All right, let's see. Can everyone hear me? The regular stream check. Great. Yeah, I haven't really done one of these in a while, so I'm a bit, all my stuff wasn't really working, but it is now, so great. Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for joining me in this little look at our latest FM synth, Glänta. It's a Swedish name. Thought it would be fun to use something Swedish this time around. It means like forest meadow, sort of. I don't know. I feel like a nice FM synth can be like a nice meadow. So why not? And also here is like our free ROM reverb doing the ambiance. So yeah, I'm gonna walk through the device, how it works, some like ideas behind it, and why we call it a dynamic FM synth and everything that means. And if there is like any questions or anything, just write in the chat and I'll respond. So yeah, let's try and listen to this without so much reverb. Maybe a clean patch also. Yeah, this is like a sort of simplified FM synth I've been wanting to make for a while, thought about for a while. Like I have this love for two operator FM synthesis, which I think is pretty obvious from some of my output. But I think it's if it's done right, it's like such a nice sound sculpting tool. I don't think you need like a fully fledged FM synth for all the types of nice sounds out there. So the type of sounds you can make with two operator FM synth that I think are really nice, I wanted to do something that could achieve that easily and like in a nice way, and with some like flair that didn't like make things harder, but more interesting maybe. So the basic layout is pretty simple. As you can see, it's a two operator FM synth. For those of you who don't know what that exactly means, for FM synths, usually you call the oscillators operators, and what that basically just means is usually it's an oscillator tied to an envelope, and that gets interconnected to the other operators. And typically you call the operators things like modulator and carrier, referring to like the oscillator that is modulating something, and then the oscillator that is like carrying the result of that modulation. So that's sort of where that nomenclature comes from. But here it's really just two oscillators to worry about. We named the modulator and carrier for just convenience, to sort of relate into the typical FM sphere. And Glänta bases all of its oscillators on sine waves, which is sort of the typical FM approach. You can use other waveforms too, but there comes a lot of caveats with doing that. And I feel like using sine waves is like, it gives you a lot of flexibility for what to do with the basic waveform, and also it's pretty easy to handle, so things don't like get completely out of, you don't get a bunch of like harmonic spikes and stuff, but it's sort of like lets you more sculpt things yourself, which I think is quite nice. So if you just play a basic patch, it's just, little sine waves. And sort of the principle of FM is that you modulate one sine wave with another, and that causes sort of an imprint in the wave. What's actually happening is called phase modulation. It's the same thing as like a DX7 or whatever. It's just typically what you go for when making a digital implementation. So same for this one. And that just basically means that you add things to the face of the oscillator, and what that does is keep things in tune and also allows you to do cool stuff like feedback, which we've done a pretty interesting thing with on this one, which I'll dive into. So if you increase the level here of the modulator, you'll start hearing the modulation. So you're basically introducing like a pattern into the wave of the carrier oscillator by increasing the level of the modulator, and that creates a different wave shape, which you see here live in the interface, which is really nice to be able to kind of visualize what actually happens. And this can go from sort of very subtle sounds to very abrasive sounds. And another important thing that's happening is the ratio between the different oscillators. And this is another FM term where typically you mean the ratio to like the bass frequency that's being played. And in this case, that means the MIDI note. So the ratio, a ratio 1 will just be the MIDI note's frequency. And if I increase it to 2, it will be an octave above, and then 3 will be more in terms of the harmonic series, like basically the frequency times 3 and so on and so forth. And this basically, if I change the modulator, I'll basically change the timbre of the modulation. And the higher you go, the more the more complexity you introduce into the waveform pattern, if you want to call it that. And sort of the more complexity and more like the more sort of inharmonicity can be heard in a way, the sidebands of the waveform increases and it starts to sound more like a bell or something more complex. But interestingly, at quite low ratios, you can reproduce classic waveforms such as saw if you introduce a little bit of level on a 1-to-1 ratio. It starts more sounding like a very dull saw wave. And if I then increase the ratio to 2, we'll start hearing something that sounds more like a square wave, albeit very soft. And this is where feedback comes in. So feedback basically takes the output of the oscillator and feeds it back into itself as modulation. And this causes a sort of sharpening thing happening. So if I turn off feedback on the modulator now, we'll start hearing the waveform or the shape become more and more sharp. Up until a point where it starts becoming like a pseudo-chaotic behavior where it starts sounding more like noise. And that's just basically overblowing the feedback path, which is like causing it to read through the oscillator in ways that are just kind of going a little bit crazy. But when just doing more sensible stuff like this, you can sort of make sounds that sound like sort of an analog-ish or classic type wave shape. Or again, a saw wave. And with Glänta, what we did was make the feedback frequency compensated. So what this means is that the higher you go, the lower you go in the keyboard range, it will sort of try to keep the same wave shape across octaves. So sort of for a consistent timbre, we're using feedback. Typically, you can get a lot of like aliasing and spikes and stuff with feedback, but we wanted to make something where you can fully utilize the feedback to like make these wave shapes that are maybe not so like classic FM, but more like if you want to do these sort of saw or square or explore that more like brighter side of things and keep it consistent across octaves and sample rates. And like if you increase the sample rate in your DAW, you'll get more sharpness because the Nyquist frequency is higher, meaning that you can, that's a term that means that you can represent digital audio at a higher fidelity, if you will, higher up frequencies can be represented accurately, so then you'll get a bit more high frequency content, which is quite nice. I'm running it in 48K right now, which I think sounds good. 96K sounds even better if you want like really sharp sounds, but it's sort of tuned to sound really nice in any sample rate. That's just like very nerdy info, but quite nice still. And the feedback also does something a little bit different, and it's bipolar. And that can mean a lot of things. And in this case, it doesn't just mean that it goes negatively. So if you have a negative feedback, you can sort of invert the phase and achieve a different kind of waveform. Like all of these things are just tricks with the phase of the wave. And what that means is basically any wave, any like oscillator has like a phase. It goes from probably usually like 0 to 1 in digital stuff. You have like a counter that counts down or up or whatever. Sometimes it's minus pi to pi. But regardless, here it's like a sort of a saw wave counting through a wavetable, and then that saw wave gets sort of, or the counter rather gets modulated and creates a different trajectory that scans through the sine wave table in different ways, creating these different timbres. So all these things are just trickery with that. And yes, this is similar probably to how the Reface DX has sort of saw or square feedback, although they don't really do noise, so I don't really know if it's like actual phase modulation feedback on that one, but which is something I really wanted here, was to have both this like sort of square saw thing happening, but also the classic noise capability. So positive feedback, we'll just try it with a carrier, will sound like, yeah, like a saw wave. And if you turn it down, it'll sound more like a square wave. And the square wave is sort of, what's happening there is that the output gets squared, just like multiplied by itself basically, and then fed back in, and that creates this sort of squarish sound. And if you use the modulator for this, you can also achieve noisy patterns. And these can of course be combined for some quite intricate sounds. So so it's just like helping along to make these more like atypical FM sounds, where it's not this like very bright bellish stuff, but it's more like the sort of crisp, more towards VA or more like subtractive-ish stuff. And you can also sort of do those kind of sounds with this. Like if just by using one oscillator, really, I could sort of make like a subtractive square. If I do negative feedback on the carrier, which will still be attenuated by its envelope. So this will sort of create almost like a filter pluck. So this is something you typically need like 2 operators for, and I think that's also why this is quite cool, having like this super simple setup, but a lot of control over the individual elements in this specific way. And I think that's where I wanted its strength to lie, sort of the complexity of simplicity in a way. So now you can bring in the modulator for like extra sizzle or something on top. Which sounds almost more like a buchla or something like that, with like wave folders and stuff, because you're having a lot of different quite complex modulations going on at once that in some cases get like a sort of chaotic relationship. The envelopes sort of also affect the timbre due to attenuating the modulation signal, so that becomes part of sort of the sound shaping process. The ratio has a coarse control, which basically just multiplies the frequency, like I was talking about earlier. But it also has a fine control, which lets you. So this timbre is more or less stable. When you sustain it, it will just have this pattern, like it will sound the same, there's no movement or anything. But if you introduce a little bit of fine tune to the ratio, they will no longer lock, so to speak, and you'll hear sort of drifting in the timbre. And since this is also part of the ratio, this will always be relative to the pitch of the incoming note. So as you increase or decrease the note input or the MIDI note being played, you hear that sort of the modulation gets faster and faster. So if you don't want that and you want sort of your drifting to be consistent, regardless of which pitch you're playing, this control here is a sort of drift control which offsets the oscillator's hertz, which is independent from the ratio and allows you to do these same like you call it vibrato of drifts or whatever that are consistent across the keyboard, which is really handy for doing anything that sort of you don't want it to sound all over the place when you have a melody or different bass notes or whatever that should have the same sort of drifting pattern. Another cool thing about the modulator is that it has this little button right here which enables a stereo mode, and this basically puts the modulation itself into a stereo relationship. So it doubles the signal, but only the modulation of the signal changes. So the actual like sidebands of the FM is what gets sort of shot out into the stereo field. So yeah, this probably requires headphones to fully hear, but it's sort of an extreme widening effect, and stuff like the drift and things like this will of course play a big role in how this sounds. So it's kind of just a very intense phase shift, which I believe is summable to mono and should work in most cases. There could be some instances where you have a specific setting that could make weird stuff happen in mono, but it should be fine. Another setting right here is the phase reset. So typically most FM synths, they sort of reset the phase of the oscillator each time you hit a key, and this is just to sort of keep the phase, the timbre consistent. Every time you hit the key, you sort of get the same starting point. If you have things that are drifting or sort of going all over the place, it'll always sort of reset. So if I have something that has like a lot of drifting, maybe slower, just a little more. So let's try to get a good example going. Turn over. Too much. Sort of get the same like wow. But if you turn that off, it's kind of more, it kind of more sounds like a free running oscillator on like a virtual analog synth or something like that. And again, with sort of stereo modulation, it will be more jumpy because it's not resetting the phase every time. And this is like modulator specific, like the stereo thing is a modulator specific thing because it's only modulation. So the carrier has sort of a carrier specific thing that is a similar idea in a way. I really love unison on FM synths because it lets you play with like the start of the phase and stuff like that, and can be used as something like a sound design tool or a musical tool. So this control right here, the little lines and the value that's instead of fine on the carrier is a unison. So when you increase that, you'll introduce an oscillator above and below the principal carrier oscillator, or rather the whole sound. So let's try another sound for a while. This is a little bellish. Good. So which can sort of be used for this sort of shimmery unison, pairs well with like the stereo setting. And the detune is happening in semitones, so that means that you can tune it also. So right now it's detuning by 0.25 semitones above and below. So if I increase that to something like 7, I'll have a fifth above and below. So that's pretty useful for making sort of like auto chord thing, or like nice rave stab or something like that. Or more like a sub oscillator or organ. It is similar to the one in Doublet also, or other sort of FM focused, but with wavetables as well, synth. So it's quite easy to get these like very classic sounds with them, which I think is quite cool, because typically with FM synths you're so fast to enter in this like different world of a lot of like typically FM-y sounds, but I know that you can like get these things, but they're kind of like hard to set up on other FM synths. So I wanted something that is like very straightforward to do this stuff that's typically kind of esoteric in a way. So that's why it has so many specific little controls that aren't, it also has glide, which you can make your very snappy bass lines. And then we can also cross modulate here. So this is where it gets kind of weird. So as I said, the feedback feeds the oscillator signal back into itself, creating sort of more a sharper sound in a way. So I thought, I was playing around with like sort of this setup with having feedback on both operators, but then also trying to sort of feedback them both back again, creating this big chaos in a way. So you can basically modulate the modulator with the carrier, which creates a cross modulation. Quite neat. You can do very abrasive sounds. What was I about to say? Yeah, and another thing here, so again, sort of my idea with this was sort of have everything as simple as possible in terms of what's available to you, but make those controls really kind of deep in what in the range of what they can achieve. So you can, for example, do really weird stuff like turn the ratio to 0, which essentially just mutes the modulator, or the oscillator rather. So then you might ask what the point of that is. Well, if you have a ratio of 0 and you modulate that, you'll essentially have created a wave folder. So if I increase the cross modulation depth from the carrier to ratio with the to the modulator with a ratio of 0, I get some kind of signal, which let's pull that down a little, which probably more effective to have the ratio zeroed on the carrier. But essentially here then we see how when I increase the modulation rate, I start to get this like folding pattern, which is very similar to normal modulation, but it's essentially like sine folding or wave folding. And you can use the feedback for this as well to like find different. It sounds maybe a little grittier. I think it's interesting to like have like a little bit of detuning going on and stuff like that, because then you kind of catch on stuff. That's sort of the rundown of all the different direct sound shaping tools that directly affect the oscillators. And so they're both tied to an envelope, obviously. And these just sort of affect things over time, to state the obvious. But here I wanted to make envelopes that sort of, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Electron Digitone, and I wanted to sort of take off where that left. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that machine, it has envelopes that are called attack, decay, end. And these are like a concept I came up with, which sort of is a simpler type of FM envelope that instead of having a decay that always goes to zero, you can control the level of that, the floor of the decay, basically. So here, so for Glänta, I decided to expand that into a full ADSR, which I thought would be quite cool, together with control of the start level as well. So you can have sort of fade-ins that start sort of in the middle of your amplitude, if that's how you want to look at it, which is weird, I realize. But if we want to start with some modulation already there and fade more in, or so it just sort of adds this flexibility on top without really being that hard to control. So it's a very normal ADSR, but with these extensions. Let's switch back to having an actual ratio for the let's do 3. So instead of, as you hear, the like first onset of the sound, since the carrier envelope has almost no attack, it's very instant, you can clearly hear that it's just a sine wave. So if you want the attack to have a little more richness in it, you can increase the start level, which as you hear, has some of the timbre modulation there and then races to its like peak. And then of course we have a decay stage. That's from when it reaches the peak of the attack, it goes down to the sustain level. And that's where we, after that, when we release the key, it goes into the release stage and does a final fade out. And here's where you can control the end level. So instead of it fading out like this into essentially a sine wave, you can make it sort of have a bit of modulation left. Or even make it go up after. So you can make these funky. So when you release the key, it will actually go up to the peak again. So it's a very flexible envelope for FM without really introducing anything that strange. It's just a regular ADSR with adjustable start and end levels, which I really appreciate to work with. I think it's a nice way of dealing with FM because typically you want sort of a consistent, some sort of floor for the timbre to end up on. Like you don't always want to just decay to sine waves, or sometimes you don't want to decay at all. Sometimes you just want a really consistent like max. Just like consistent timbre, and maybe you introduce a little bit of now for the last trick. The ADSR of the modulator can loop, and what this means is that it will, as long as you hold the key down, it will repeat from the start of the envelope to attack to decay and then back again. So that can also create some interesting rhythmic effects. So that's kind of all the controls, actually. Well, you can set the amount of voices up to 16. You can change the volume. But that's kind of all the controls in Glänta. But as you can see, they have a lot of nuance and they have a lot of possibilities within this simplicity. The structure is simple, but sort of the controls are quite deep. The looping envelope can't be synced, but probably, I think we're probably gonna update some stuff at some point, and then we have some ideas of stuff to throw in, but that's kind of a given, depending on how well that plays with the envelope times and stuff. Some people were asking about percussive sound design with Glänta, and this is not really where it shines, but you can definitely do it. You just have to sort of use so the envelopes are quite snappy, so they can be used to make sort of percussive stuff. Oh, maybe I changed this now after I this was once. This is sort of a poor attempt at a kick. You can sort of do these. So since it doesn't have a pitch envelope, you have to sort of rely on using the modulator as a transient. And I find it kind of useful to use the unison because it kind of beefs things up a little bit. Can make these kind of freaky alien. I should have some better presets for this. It's quite finicky. Huh? It's quite finny to get like really nice drums out of it, because it's not made for that necessarily, but certainly works. So yeah, this patch basically plays with this basic concept of using the modulator with a really snappy envelope and then coaxing some bass out of that. Can do stuff like introduce unison and some more feedback, and then we can get these phasey, weird. It's quite fun to make percussion with. But not having a pitch envelope makes it a little tricky, but it's semi-possible to make it snare. You sort of just have to leverage the envelopes and kind of find a balance between making something very snappy and also like here, for example, with the snare, the modulator is used as the noise source, with the carrier having a really short decay, which makes everything sound quite snappy. and can play around with like decreasing the decay of the modulator to make these kind of more weird tonal snares. Something I do a lot with snares, with like FM stuff, is introduce a little bit of attack so you get like more body on the hit. You kind of get these like rush snares. But yeah, also possible to do hi-hats. That wasn't it. That's basically, you just push the note really high up and use some detune to get like this spread of oscillators that you find in a lot of hi-hat synthesis, and then making those quite high frequency. Sometimes it's nice to, like, if you really push things, you can get aliasing, so that works to get like a metallic sound, a classic FM trick. Quite a lot of fun sounds to be found. Apologies if you hear my system's sounds. Probably is the answer to that. And yeah, all the parameters are of course automatable. You can just check them all out like this, like usual. All of them are there. So one thing that's a little different, so if we load up like the LFO in live, and we want to modulate something, the mapping to like the interface elements, like the sliders and the little GUI things, won't actually map it, but you use the values directly. And this is just basically because the UI is entirely custom, and in the past I've sort of reskinned live UI objects, but I found that it's kind of more consistent with like thing when you go this like far with Max for Live. I feel it's more consistent to do it this way is sort of the answer to this. It kind of creates an experience that's a little less janky, because like yeah, I don't want to get too into it, but this is why you have to map to the actual values instead of pressing the sliders. But yeah, it's totally mappable, MIDI mappable. Yeah, go nuts. Yeah, let's see. Someone asked a few questions. What's your favorite tube operator piece hardware? There's not that much hardware out there that's only two operators, I think, right? But there's some stuff based on like, well, that's not two operator either. Yeah, is there any hardware? Well, Nord has a lot of, like the Nord drum has some two operator modes that are super fun. The Nord drum 2, I'll say that. Yeah, that was kind of, was there any? What's the easiest way to decrease the UI? Yeah, so that's going into Ableton settings and just choose a different scaling for the DAW. Yeah. So yeah, if there's any questions or anything right now, I'll take them. Yeah, a lot of two operator hardware. Yeah, except the Yamaha DX200. It's quite tricky to program. Quite cool though. Has some interesting ideas about simplifying FM, but I feel like the UI is really tough on that one with a lot of Yamaha's 90s gear. Is quite like menu divey in this specific way. Yeah, this will be uploaded to YouTube later. So. How did Glänta development happen? Yeah, I've been working on something for a really long time, and it has some FM stuff, and I felt like while I was working on that, I figured it would be easy to make this, so I did. What do I think of Rainbow? Yeah, Rainbow by Cycling74, the newest Max release launched this week, which is really cool. I've actually done some example content for it, so I've had it for quite a while. And yeah, it's basically super cool. I haven't actually gotten around to using a lot of the export functionality quite yet, but we'll see what that means for us in the long run. But right now, I don't think it will change anything for Force. But super cool, and they've been working on it for a really long time, and I think it's really sick what they pulled off. Would Force ever do a hardware unit? The Osiris notwithstanding. Yeah, I mean, hardware I think right now is at a stage where it's not primed to get into. The most recent hardware I worked on was this Trinity drum module, also by Modbap. See if that shows up nicely. This is all the synth engines are developed by me in it, and we of course work together on like the concepts of things, but this is as close as you'll get to Force hardware for now. It's basically my answer. And yeah, you should check the Trinity out. It's a really nice drum module. It has sort of a little bit of everything, really. FM additive, sort of analog inspired, and a really wacky sort of digital noise oscillator. It's been a really fun project to work on. Yeah, but hardware, I think, is like it's not a great time to get into. I think we would I think it's cool. Like, of course, it would be nice to do a hardware thing, but we would need a lot of people to make that happen, and I don't feel like that's the right time. I hope you guys will have stuff in the future that isn't Teddy's Live. Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah. We would, of course, love for a lot more people to be able to use our stuff. So yeah, I think that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and yeah, as I said, we'll upload this to YouTube shortly. And I hope this tour of Glänta gave you some nice insight and some nice ideas. And yeah, hopefully the next show and tell won't be a year apart from the last.